Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Yasmina Zaidman, the Chief of Development and Partnerships at Acumen. Yasmina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I went down a Acumen rabbit hole once my friend kind of introduced you all to me, and what an incredible organization and story. And I'm just so kind of honored to have you on the show and try to highlight this work that you all have been doing for so long now. So thanks for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, no, it's exciting for me because I think there's lots of people who are, in the community and excited about our work, but I feel like there's so many more that have never heard of this before and often get really excited. People who care about entrepreneurship and investing, but see the impact that's possible. They tend to get pretty psyched when they hear about Acumen.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I'm going to have links because the Acumen website has like an incredible amount of resources about all of these different um, entrepreneurs and programs that you guys have supported over the years, and it's just a really compelling story about social impact and business in general, but also about like what's possible in the modern age when it comes to fighting things that seem sort of difficult to get your arms around, like poverty or access to electricity or sustainability and these things that people do care about. And I think the more people that know about Acumen, the better. Long story short.
I'm with you there.
Yeah. So I figure a good place to start is just let's talk a little bit about what you're working on right now at Acumen. Give our listeners a sense of like what's going on, what is Acumen, what's happening there.
Yeah, so the best way to think about Acumen as is like this global force of entrepreneurs, investors, and philanthropists that are working together to alleviate poverty. And the way we talk about it is really building a world based on dignity. And I like using the word dignity because it can mean a lot of different things and it starts a great conversation. Like, what does dignity mean? Because we've learned that, poverty is relative. There's poverty everywhere. And what really interferes with people's sense of dignity isn't always how much money they're making, but it's to what degree they have agency in terms of being able to choose what they do for a living. It has to do with being able to make choices that help their families to thrive. And so all of the companies that we work with are giving consumers either more dignified work, higher incomes, or products and services that help them make their lives the ones that they want in terms of, accessing healthcare or being able to turn a light on and have your kids do their homework at night. So that's kind of what we do. We were founded by Jacqueline Novogratz in 2001 with this idea that business, if you really cultivate the tools of business using moral imagination, can actually be a huge driver in solving problems of poverty. And so we are one of the world's leading nonprofit impact investors. We invest capital along the full spectrum of what entrepreneurs need. And our job is to find and scale businesses that are solving the world's biggest problems.
Um, I want to ask about the businesses in a second, but I want to go back to this core idea about the the idea of dignity and the relationship between agency and dignity. It sounds like that was like a core philosophical discovery of Jacqueline or the entire Acumen team. Do you know the origin story of where that came from? Because I feel like it's a really profound point, and it's one that's worth like people really thinking about. I've been thinking about it, for several weeks now since I first discovered it. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple stories that I think have really been foundational for the organization and our philosophy. There's almost too many stories because I think that's a big part of who we are. Is we have a manifesto, and it says it starts by listening to voices unheard. And so, what I've found in my own experiences is when you sit with someone who is facing a lot of challenges related to poverty, that they can share their story with you and you start to really understand, what dignity means for them. I know for Jacqueline, she had been working in women's banking early on, and she was in Rwanda before the genocide, where she was helping to start the world's first microfinance bank in Rwanda. And in that journey, and she talks about it a lot in a book she wrote called The Blue Sweater, she talks about how difficult it was to really partner with the community and to communicate to them as, an outsider, that this was meant to be by them and for them. And so where you can have this kind of beautiful idea that, everybody is just ready to jump in and have agency, people have often just dealt with a lot of things that have eroded their sense of dignity or their sense of trust, their hope in possibility. And so that was sort of a foundational story when she realized that, like, it would take real time to build trust with this group of women that she was partnering with before they really understood that this was, meant to be by and for them. And that's something that, we take very seriously. That it's one of the reasons we like working with entrepreneurs, that no matter how good our intentions are, whatever we come up with, sitting in our offices in New York or even in Nairobi or Lagos, is never going to match what a customer can communicate about what they need, what they value, what they're willing to pay for. So that's sort of how that translated. And then there's another wonderful story that Jacqueline has probably told more than she ever wanted to. But when she was in Rwanda, she was running one day and she saw a little boy wearing a sweater that she had put into Goodwill as a child. And she literally kind of like freaked out, ran over and looked at the tag because it had her name on it. And I think the point of that story is that what we do, wherever we sit, whether we happen to be born in a place that has offered us opportunity and agency, that our dignity matters too, and what we do matters. And so she's found that working with this really diverse global community of, both low-income communities and entrepreneurs, but also philanthropists and investors and leaders of organizations, that people's ability to make a difference on things that matter to them also gives them dignity. So it's definitely a two-way street. And that's something that, again, I think is suffused in our organization, that doing this work and partnering in these ways at all ends of the scale is what gives us a feeling of dignity.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like it's so easy to go about something like this with incredibly good intentions, but come across maybe as paternal, maybe too paternalistic, or just not getting it, And I feel like that probably happens more often than not. There's actually this great documentary called Restrepo, which covers like the war in Afghanistan, and there's a famous scene in there where these well-intentioned U.S. military leaders are in meeting with a group of Afghan citizens and talking about jobs and like how they're going to come and bring jobs to this place. And you could tell like no one in that room could care less about jobs. Like they don't even have jobs. These are people who are like working in agriculture,
Yeah.
Subsistence agriculture. And it was just like a perfect example of like what not to do, unfortunately. No offense to the commanders that were trying to do, what they thought was the right thing, but it's just an interesting anecdote.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's why, like, to do this kind of work, and again, whether you're sitting in a giant corporation or an impact fund or a nonprofit, this idea of listening and really putting people at the center of the process is super powerful. Because honestly, I think every one of us at Acumen has had this experience of like having our assumptions challenged dramatically. I think we were visiting a community. Jacqueline was meeting with some women in Pakistan to talk to them about energy access and how great it would be to have light after dark. And it was a particularly hot day in a particularly hot region of Pakistan. And they were like, what do you have that can get us access to a fan? Like, that's really top of mind right now. And honestly, like, the technologies for energy access really started with lighting. But other sorts of products that enabled people to use energy for something other than lighting have been much slower to arrive. But it had a big impact on us. What are the products that people need to access with solar power that don't exist yet? And can we help catalyze that? Because that's what the consumers are saying, that they love the light and they need more. They might need like a refrigerator, a fan, a television. And that, again, goes back to this idea of dignity and choice, that
Yeah.
that's the dynamic of an entrepreneur, is like, how are you really responding to the needs of your customers?
Yep. I feel like another core maybe insight from the work that you all have done is like the importance of business and entrepreneurship in the landscape of sort of trying to make a difference on something like poverty, because there's one thing to give a bunch of money, and that expression of charity is not a bad expression. But I really like what Acumen has been doing for 20 years, because it does create like a more self-sustaining, and obviously it has this ancillary benefit around the dignity and agency, but it's also self-sustaining in that it's not just a one-time give, like here's all the food I could possibly buy at this moment in time. Here you go. It's more like, hey, what if we created an ecosystem where we could deliver, enough electricity for fans, or whatever the use case may be. I feel like that is a super empowering core insight from the Acumen experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that for us have been kind of like a North Star from the beginning that were really meant to serve as an alternative to some of what you're describing, which can be, very kind of top down and maybe short term. And those there are three principles that, really come up, particularly when we're looking at individual companies that we want to invest in, and they're scale, sustainability, and innovation. And we work with companies that are definitely not scaled, right? We're trying to find local entrepreneurs that they need to have the potential to scale, and the aspiration to scale in order to fit for what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make markets, and the problems that we're looking at are definitely scaled problems, right? These are problems that affect tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. And so, you know, that's just one of those things we look at of like, you have a model that could scale. And what that means might differ depending on whether you're trying to aggregate, smallholder farmers to produce a crop at a much higher return for the farmer, or if it's something like a solar light or a technology where scale might be a very different number. But it needs to be big enough that it is really showing a path forward to solve that problem, potentially for everyone, right? Where you show like, oh, there's now tens of thousands of farmers that are operating differently. What would it take to multiply that to hundreds of thousands or millions?
No, I love it. Yeah.
The second one is sustainability. And again, it goes to that point of, if this is a good idea, how will it sustain over time? And that's why for us, working with business models is so important, because we want to see that the business model itself is sustainable, and that based on revenues, a company can grow. We want to see our companies raise more capital. So we've invested about $200 million in 215 companies, but we've seen them go on to raise about $1 billion. And ultimately, we know actually a lot more capital is needed. So sustainability is like, how do you sustain the growth so that you can really fulfill that long-term potential? And will that be surely through revenue? Will that be through investment capital? How do you build that? We've even looked at, is the customer the person who consumes the product, or is the customer the government? Because in some cases, we see governments saying, oh my gosh, you found a way to deliver something that we should be delivering, but you're doing it really reliably and at a low cost. Can we be your customer? Or can we subsidize this product so that it grows even faster? We're seeing really creative stuff right now in terms of sustainability in monetizing social impact. And probably the way people know that the best is with carbon credits. But if you have a product like a cook stove that is dramatically reducing deforestation in a way that benefits everyone, there's a market for those carbon credits. And those carbon credits can help reduce the price of the stove so it becomes affordable to 10 times more people. And so those questions about sustainability can get really creative. Like, what does that really mean? But ultimately, it's like, if this is a good idea, we want it to get bigger and go on forever. And then the last one is innovation. And, we've talked to a lot of different peers and organizations, and everyone has to kind of find their niche. Some people really want to focus on what works, and they just want to make that bigger. And I love that. For us, we want to find the stuff that hasn't been proven yet, because what we've seen with a lot of these issues is that we need more good ideas. We can't just stick to what we know today. So we look to entrepreneurs as innovators. And when we see a business model, even if we're like, ooh, that has not been done before, that looks risky, is that an innovation that could make a big difference? Because we've signed up for that risk. We want to see new ideas that aren't already proven in the marketplace.
Yeah. So of the 215 companies, 200 million, give us a flavor of like a highlights. It's probably impossible to summarize it, but I know there's probably some categories. Like, what types of businesses are these, and what are some of the like super success stories.
Yeah, so we definitely have focused on a few sectors where we see this approach having a lot of potential to achieve those outcomes. The big ones for us are energy access, which I've touched on. Agriculture is a really important space. Most of the world's poor are smallholder farmers, and these are the people that are growing food for the world, not only trying to sustain themselves, but they face tremendous obstacles in terms of how markets are designed. And those obstacles are getting worse in the face of climate change. So we do a lot of work around climate resilient agriculture and really making sure that smallholder farmers have the tools, the financing, the market access, the technologies that can help them not just survive, but thrive, secure the food system, and be resilient in the face of climate change. And I think connected to both of those, we really put people and planet kind of at the center of everything we do now. We're really interested in the kinds of business models that create meaningful jobs for low income people. So in a lot of the countries where we work, we're doing a ton in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries across East Africa and West Africa, also in India, in Latin America, and Pakistan. What you see is there's a really massive informal sector. So people who really don't have any sort of job security, protections, benefits. And we're really looking for those entrepreneurs that can find ways to bring people into formal employment. So that could be in like the waste management sector. You can't imagine a source of income that makes you more vulnerable than that. You just sort of get paid for what you collect. And if you're risking your life doing it, or your employer decides to pay you a different amount, there's nothing you can do. So we see entrepreneurs that are really looking at this sector and saying, what if we bring dignity there, safety, reliability, benefits? Because at the end of the day, these are people that are dealing with something that's broken in the system in terms of completely unregulated waste. And they shouldn't have to bear the brunt of that, right, through lack of dignity and safety. So
Yeah.
jobs, agricultural income, access to energy, these are things that we see people using to get themselves out of poverty and where we put a lot of our investment dollars.
Okay. And I remember, I forget the exact number, but on the access to energy one, there's been some like phenomenal success. It was in the millions upon millions of people who did not, right? Like as a result of your all Acumen's investments in these companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So in total, the companies we've worked with have touched the lives of 650 million people. And most of those have been in energy. And so we're seeing hundreds of millions of people that are getting on this ladder of energy access. And in some cases, because our companies have been able to, again, help people move out of poverty, support their expanding needs for energy access, we have people who can use energy now to run a small shop or a small factory, and really use energy to increase their income. And many, many millions more that, again, have the luxury of turning on a light, getting rid of kerosene and other sort of plant-based fuels that are dangerous and expensive and unhealthy. It's one of those things that it kind of boggles the mind to think of how many families are living without a technology that we've had for hundreds of years, but also how quickly things change when folks are able to tap in. And we're leapfrogging, right? The ways that people use cell phones now and charge their phones, like we see huge potential to leapfrog systems that were built, in the industrialized economies, through things like solar energy and cell phone technology and digital technology that is enabling people to communicate and work and save in whole new ways.
Yeah. This energy access issue, like it really hits home what you all are doing and what the world is like. I was actually talking to my kids about you this morning. I was talking about, hey, I'm doing this podcast, and I've told them this story about how there's large numbers of people who live without access to reliable electricity. And my youngest son, who's only 6, was like, "Oh, if we go there, then I can't play Roblox." That's what's top of mind to him. I'm like, "Yeah, there's no internet. If there's no electricity, there's no internet. You're definitely not playing on your iPad." And that sort of blew his mind. Um, but it's wild that we live in a world where this country has crazy wealth relative to someone who's living without electricity. It's staggering.
It is, and it's also it is holding people back, right? I think that's the thing that we often miss is that it isn't just about people's, moral right to participate, but it's the kind of world we would live in if kids your, son's age had access to the technologies and the energy that supported their education, supported their ability to participate and contribute. So it's kind of all of our loss. But what's been really cool is, again, we find these entrepreneurs, like if you're ever feeling hopeless and you look around, that there are entrepreneurs out there that are seeing these gaps and these problems and they're just taking them head on. So we work with a company in Kenya called Akili Networks, and they're an incredibly successful private commercial television station that provides mostly content for children. They're like the second most watched television show or television network. And what we're finding is that when people get access to electricity, they do want to watch television, not just because they want to be entertained, but they want to know what's going on in the world. They want to understand what risks they're facing, and they want their kids to learn. And so they're using this content from one of our companies on products that other companies that we've invested in have helped get into their homes. And the end result is, hopefully a generation of kids who may not be playing Roblox, but they're getting access to really high quality educational content that helps them feel connected to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you invested a bunch in education technologies as well
We
for
do
business?
have an education portfolio in East Africa, and I would say it's not nearly as big as our energy work, but we are seeing some really amazing opportunities to connect things like energy access or workforce development to education for kids themselves. It's a really interesting space because, of course, we know that the public sector has such a huge role to play in providing education and creating that even playing field. But we're seeing entrepreneurs that are developing tools and technologies to improve teacher training or help link parents to educational outcomes for their kids or develop new curriculum that is sort of up to date. Or this Akili Networks that's making that curriculum available through television. So again, where we see that opportunity, we're like, are there sustainable business models that could scale and are truly innovative and measurably improve the lives of low-income people? That's definitely a space we're going to want to look at.
Yeah, I feel like there's tremendous opportunity in that world. It's probably tough to figure out the business side of it, but the demand is unlimited, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's for us been, both exciting and humbling. We've worked in a couple different sectors where we're no longer really focusing our energy, and sometimes we'll work in a space to kind of understand what the opportunities are and determine whether or not we want to go deeper. But markets can play a really important role. They're not a panacea, right? And we see it as a powerful tool to tackle problems, but not the answer. And so understanding the role of markets in a space like education or even energy access, where clearly the government can also play an important role, is a little bit tricky. And my view is that it will take all of us. So we expect to see, entrepreneurs being really thoughtful about what are the policies or opportunities to partner with government. We often see civil society playing a huge role, nonprofits that are helping to build trust or build capacity for people that can then participate. We worked with a company in India that was using rice husks, which is like an agricultural waste product, to produce energy. And they built these facilities to process rice husks close to the farms. And so they needed to find people that had enough education that they could operate a kind of scaled facility to process rice husks into energy. And they weren't seeing the level of education that was needed to operate these. They couldn't just hire people from the main cities and send them into these deep remote rural communities. So they built a university. They built a program to provide the level of education that would support people playing that role. A lot of them were women who now were playing a technical role managing a essentially small scale manufacturing facility. And it was a gap that they felt like they needed to fill. But the university was subsidized, right? And I think to me, just understanding that they've got a commercial operation, but it needs philanthropy to help build that capability so that the commercial opportunity can work as well. And that's just something I really encourage people to think about, because folks do get so excited about entrepreneurship and using investment. And they often just jump right into like, this is perfect. Like everyone's making money, everything is growing, everybody's happy, people get what they want. And what we've learned is that these problems are so complex and intractable, and they're in systems that are broken in so many different ways. You're going to see a combination of different kinds of capital. And even on the investor side, you'll see some investors taking a lot of risk, maybe even being willing to forego return. And then you'll see some other investors that want to come in at a point that's less risky. And they all have a role to play. But I always try to encourage people to kind of avoid that overenthusiasm about, doing good and doing well, that this is a space where there's just tons of money to be made. Because if you are making a ton of money while solving problems of poverty, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, at what cost? Are you taking the right level of risk? Are you paying the people at the sort of, end of the value chain enough to really be successful in their lives? So it's like you have to take the market's piece with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because like even thinking about the finance world where Jacqueline kind of got started, like there are businesses that have been providing what ultimately is a valuable service. Like take, for example, in America, like cash checking for people who are unbanked, but they're charging them, they're making a ton of money, and they're also doing good, which is people who actually need to convert these checks that they're getting into cash. But what is that really the right solution for that group of people? And it's a question.
It is a question. And, again, people have to figure out, where they fit into that market landscape. I've sometimes been asked, like, how do you convince an investor to give up return? And I'm like, most of the investors I know aren't investing their own money, right? They work on behalf of someone else's capital. And so they don't have the freedom to forego return. They could maybe work to educate the sources of capital that they work with. But ultimately, people who allocate capital are going to be in the best position to say, this is the expectation that I have. And hopefully, more and more combining this conversation about returns with what kind of world am I trying to build? And I think that's a theme that you've really touched on in this program. Like, how much is enough? What is the cost of my investment strategy? And also, what kind of social impact or environmental impact upside could I be generating with this investment alongside the financial return? There's so many options now. And I think people need to have richer conversations than just higher return or lower return.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to get into the capital, but I want to just close the loop on this subject or this topic of business is exciting, but it's not the only answer. I feel like that is, even here in the United States, there's a big bifurcation or big siloing happening in this social impact world, the social impact business world, and government, and a tremendous amount of like, hey, if you're on the government side, you're going to do these types of programs, and if you're on the social impact side, you're going to do this. When the true answer is actually in the middle. And so here in Los Angeles, where we have a tremendous housing affordability crisis and a homelessness crisis, there's all kinds of energy on both sides of that equation. And I've been working to try to get these two groups of people to talk together, because the government desperately needs private capital. And the private capital people, they don't know it or aren't willing to admit it, but they desperately need the government subsidy programs, in particular on the rents. And because they haven't been talking to each other, they've been just doing these little experiments. And the experiments are exciting, but they're not scalable. Like we need to just admit that we need each other, join forces, and create a system to produce whatever housing we need to produce. And I feel like that's probably what you've seen all over the world in different manifestations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things for us that has really shaped the whole organization is, as we started down this path, we saw that there were some of these really intractable issues that weren't about one business model or, like you said, a successful experiment, but were about the kind of leadership and values of all the different stakeholders involved across the board. And we're like, is that really our thing? But it seems like real change won't happen unless there is some kind of leadership framework evolving that moves away from kind of individual benefit or tribal interest and towards something that is more collective. So we started working on leadership just a few years into our existence. And I would say, like, from the beginning, a lot of folks really close to us said, how do these things fit together? You're trying to catalyze capital and build entrepreneurial ventures. And now you have this leadership program and you're talking about moral imagination. You're looking for these incredible emerging leaders around the world who you're describing as, architects of, a future society that will be more just and more equal. And, admittedly, it's not obvious how those things fit together, but when you describe the dilemma around housing, it's not a capital gap. It's a leadership gap, right? The willingness for people to create trust, to create dialogue, to overcome lines of difference, to even have the kind of self-awareness where people can be honest about what risks they can take and not take, what their interests are. So we built a whole program around that, and that's what Acumen Academy is. It's this real school for social change, and we've been training leaders who are looking to create more of the systemic change around the world. We've trained 1,600 individuals in all the places that we invest. We see them as, entrepreneurs, institutional leaders, but they share this common language and ethos of what it means to lead in ways that do overcome those kinds of barriers. Like, there's skills involved. Like, when you describe your dilemma, like, why can't these people come together? There's a set of skills around listening, communication, self-awareness, storytelling, adaptive leadership, human-centered design. These are hard skills that people can build that enable them to move towards those kinds of longer-term scaled solutions. So I'm super proud that we've been doing that. And now we're seeing more and more what happens when you have an entrepreneur with those leadership skills and the kind of scaled impact they can have, because they are talking to local government officials, they are talking to customers and investors, and they have a fluidity to talk to the kinds of people they need to get the work done. And so we're big believers that, there's no amount of capital that can substitute for true leadership, but if you combine them, there's these amazing things that are possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that that work you guys are doing. Let's talk briefly about the capital, because this is another area that I've run into something peculiar, and then I came across you all and discovered a mindset shift or another innovation that I think is worth talking about. So in this work I've been doing around housing, I've sort of played this role as the kind of the middle person between government and social impact or socially conscious entrepreneurs, let's call it, and started even attempting to arrange some capital for different strategies and ideas. And what I found in the landscape, at least from the conversations I had, was actually really disheartening to me, because in the social impact, at least the investors that I spoke to, there was no real discount in expectations. So, like, okay, they wanted a 17 IRR instead of a 20. But you know what? You can't build this type of stuff at a 17. Like, the market rate people are barely getting it done with ultimate, luxury and all of the best practices of business. And so time and time again in these conversations, like, oh yeah, we love it. We're all about impact, but we need a 2x multiple and a set 15 to 20 IRR minimum. But it sounds like Acumen has a totally different mindset around capital, called patient capital, which you all developed many years ago. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so for us, we start with the problem that we're trying to solve, right? We don't start with a kind of capital that we need to use. We start with the problem. And as we look at the problem and what solutions are out there, it's what helps inform the right kind of capital to use. And so, we believe in entrepreneurship as a powerful tool to solve these problems, but we're working with entrepreneurs at very different stages. So if you take up an issue, for example, like the challenges that are faced by forcibly displaced people, there are an increasing number of people who are being forced to leave their homes for different reasons, conflict, climate change, and they're trying to find ways to settle down and participate in the economy. A lot of them are in Africa. So we have some support from a funder to explore, actually three incredible funders, to explore how we might build business models that uniquely address the challenges that they face. But what we're finding is that these are very new ways of working to be able to meet the needs of communities that are even more vulnerable and disconnected because they've been displaced. And so what we recognize is that we need to go even earlier stage, provide a lot more capacity building, and that is the way we might solve this problem. Now, a few years down the road, maybe these companies will be ready for commercial capital, right? There's probably a few steps in between. But by starting with the problem, we can think about the right capital and the right expectations to set with those sources of capital. Because again, to your point, if you're talking to a traditional investor, they just aren't operating within a system where they can say, oh, yes, I care about the housing shortage, so therefore I'm going to return half of what I said I would return to my ultimate clients. They'll be fired instantly, right? And I've done a lot of work with large corporations who care not only about return, but shareholder value, revenue. And when we're proposing a solution to them of how they might work with social enterprises, we also need to help them see the business case, right? And if there's a subsidy needed, how will that create value for them in other ways? But I think there's something about challenging the system and at the same time understanding and working within the system. And the most powerful ways that I've seen, and for us with patient capital, we can make an investment in a company that we know won't exit for 7, 10, sometimes 12 years. And because we're using philanthropy, our focus is on what are we doing over that time to help this company to stabilize their business model, to grow, to attract commercial capital. And then one day we'll exit and recycle that capital. But our success metrics are around social impact and leverage, right? We want to see these companies able to attract the commercial capital that will really help them get to that next level of growth versus what is our IRR. It's just not, we don't have a hurdle rate around that. Our goal is to recycle capital. And we've been doing this for over 20 years. And we took a look back at what we had done over 20 years to understand, how did this model play out? Our goal had been recycling capital. We wanted to see 1x. And what we saw, analyzing our full portfolio over 20 years, was we got 91 cents on the dollar back, right? So it wasn't 1x, it was negative 9%. That did not include all of our costs and the time value of money. And so we said, yeah, I think patient capital versus commercial capital was probably the right call. But what these companies had done is they'd gone on to raise significantly more private capital. They had yielded positive returns for their investors, and they had impacted hundreds of millions of lives, and in some cases created whole new markets. So what we're seeing with Off-Grid Energy Access is because of over 30 companies that we've invested in. And something like, I'm trying to think the exact number. I should have this off the top of my head, but something like 600 million people got access to energy over the last 10 years. And that takes a big bite out of the number of people that don't have access. And about, I think, 30 or 40% of them got energy because of companies we invested in. So this model, which has certainly used philanthropy to catalyze these businesses and build this market, has helped pave the way for a market that is no longer reliant on philanthropy. And so for us, we then take our lens and say, okay, well, where would patient capital be useful in the energy sector? And something I'm super proud of is that this year we launched a program called Hardest to Reach, where we're taking everything we've learned from 15 years of energy investing and applying it to 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have the highest rates of poverty, the lowest rates of electrification, to say, if this could work in East Africa, in places like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, what would it take to make it work in these 16 countries where the needle has not moved for a very long time? And the reality is it's a very different kind of capital that we're going to have to, use debt, have a lot of risk, tolerance, and also layer our investments so that some investors are protected and others are willing to take that risk. So that's for us what patient capital is. It's bringing that creativity to saying, what would it take to solve the problem? And then you line up the investors that can make it happen, recognizing that they're going to sit in different places on that spectrum.
Yeah. I feel like that 91 or 0.91 multiple is actually a staggering finding because it basically shows a pathway for the future of like philanthropic efforts. It's not going to work in every scenario because sometimes you just need to give people money because there's a crisis or something. But
100%.
if that is the return rate, and there's all these other benefits, and by the way, some of these companies go on to raise commercial capital and become viable, the return rate's actually higher, then it shows that this model has like incredible long-term potential.
I really appreciate the point that you just made about what is possible if we can really be creative about using capital. And the good news is that I think this change is happening. Where when Acumen started, and 23 years ago, there were really two spaces. There was philanthropy and investing, and this gray area in between, where we're using tools of investment. Either you're getting maybe a slightly lower return, or maybe you're blending capital, or maybe you're getting a negative return, creating huge social upside. It just wasn't really a thing. And today it very much is. And so I take a lot of kind of courage from the fact that this change is starting to happen and people are recognizing that there's different ways of evaluating an investment strategy or the way you use your capital with these different considerations in mind.
Yeah. It's encouraging. Like I had a guest on just recently, a good friend of mine, who got together with some like really successful tech VCs to take venture capital investing principles and apply them to the political sphere. Now, you might hate what they did depending on where you fall politically, but it's a similar story. It's like we've learned so much about business and investing from these activities, and they can be applied in other areas. They don't work exactly the same way, but they can, and they can unlock like all kinds of new opportunities, which I think is what Acumen's legacy is going to be, is like, gosh, look at all this impact, but look at this new model. That's the legacy at this moment, at least. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I do think that the numbers can tell an amazing story, right? Whether it's, we got back so much more than anyone might have guessed, or we're seeing some companies that are in fact creating, really significant value for customers and investors. But I think there's a bigger story. And, as we're seeing what's unfolding around the world in terms of conflicts, a lot of them connected to climate change and changing weather patterns, just the increasing vulnerability. My hope is that we can use this story about the numbers and what's possible from an investment perspective alongside another narrative, which is the one about leadership. For me, when I was in business school, it was really inspiring to see how many students alongside me were saying, what I want to do with my life is solve big problems. And yes, I want to be successful and I want to be recognized and I want to be able to raise a family. But I have this North Star around, what is the role that I want to play in the face of everything that's happening in the world. And so my hope is that this idea that you have to somehow separate your values from your career or your investment strategy is going away, that those things can absolutely come together and it can kind of happen anywhere. Again, I think working in the financial sector, working in a large corporation, working in civil society or in government, there's these opportunities to say, what can we do that is sustainable and scalable, but that ultimately puts people and planet at the center?
Yeah, I love that. I agree. I think there is a movement, and there's an opportunity to make a difference kind of wherever you are. You don't have to be, have made all your money. Like one of the most common archetypes I see is like people make all this money in some very for-profit, and then they start feeling guilty because they didn't pursue their passions or whatever the psychological thing going on there. And then they start giving. But there's ways right now. That's the exciting thing about our time. There's ways to just kind of do it all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Pursue success and pursue, some kind of connection to your community and what you care about at the same time.
Yeah. And I encourage people who are excited about, being entrepreneurial or being, really smart and savvy investors is to think about the leverage that you create in your own life. Because I know that some people are kind of like, I'm going to focus on making money over here, and then I'm going to give some away with philanthropy, which is great. I mean, again, I think philanthropy is super powerful. But I think when people look at the whole picture of their lives, like what is something that you could bring to the world that would have this ripple effect, whether it's the community that you're, in and how you influence them, or inventing some new product or some new way of investing, could have such a bigger impact than just kind of creaming the top from a philanthropic perspective. So it's hopefully, if people are thinking about, what Acumen is, there's lots to learn, but our hope is that people take from our work, whether it's the reports that we publish or the courses that we offer through Acumen Academy, tools that they can use in their everyday lives to find that balance, right, of creating value, creating impact, and feeling that sense of dignity in their own lives.
Yeah. Beautifully said. And I think this is a great place to end this. I had a whole nother series of questions, so which means we need to do part 2. So I'm just going to lay the teaser out. So part 2 in my mind is I wanted to ask you some hard hitting questions about what's happening in regular, let's call it regular business. I don't know if there's such thing as regular business, but there's a lot of sort of chatter about whether or not these sustainability efforts of corporations are legitimate or not. And so that's a topic I want to explore someday. And then also how you got into this world in the first place. I feel like there's an incredible story, but we can leave that for later so you can get back to the crazily important work that you're doing.
Well, I will be on record saying I would absolutely love to have that part 2 conversation with you. I led corporate partnerships at Acumen for 10 years, and I have a lot of thoughts on the role that large companies can play in this and some of the setbacks that we've seen more recently in terms of ESG backlash. And anyway, I can go on and on. And so would love to have that follow-up conversation whenever works.
I would love that. Let's plan on it. Well, thank you so much for your time today and kind of introducing this incredibly optimistic story. And I'll make sure everyone gets the links to Acumen and your info and the academy and everything. And look forward to part 2.
Thank you so much. It was really nice chatting with you, Nick.
Thank you. Likewise.